Hello, and welcome to Humanities Headlines. I'm Georges Van Den Abbeele, Dean of the School of Humanities at the University of California, Irvine. And I'm here today with Professor Alka Patel, who's a professor of art history here at UCI and who does research, particularly on the architecture of India and Pakistan from roughly the 12th through the 16th centuries. And so I'd like to ask you, Professor Patel, if you could say, what drew you to the subject matter and what's its importance?
In general, the study of the architecture. I think I've always been fascinated by buildings in general. And, it really was the fieldwork that I did as a graduate student. In fact, I had begun working on the Islamic history of Spain in graduate school.
So the Alhambra.
Yes, I was interested in Caliphal Spain, so it would be considerably earlier,
Right.
9th, 10th century, and to about the 12th. But thanks to the training that graduate schools were emphasizing in terms of being able to teach across the Islamic world, I was able to do some field work in India. Though I had been born and spent my childhood there, it was really in graduate school that I engaged with this place in a much more analytical, academic way. So there, actually engaging with the buildings, that's when it occurred to me that I can really do things that are professionally as well as personally, I think, much more meaningful in the South Asian context.
So you work across art history, architectural studies, and archaeology in South Asian studies. So how do you balance those disciplines and how do they help you study these buildings and the art that goes with them?
Well, interestingly, the period that I tend to be most drawn to, just by itself, the material culture requires the intersection of these different disciplines, since certainly there are standing monuments, which one analyzes. However, there are a lot of temporal strata that it's very beneficial to look through. So this is where archaeology is extremely helpful. And art history, I think, in its broadest manifestation, really is all-encompassing of visual and material culture. So I guess in the end, it really would depend on the specific project. One designs or one determines the corpus of works that are to be analyzed, and then it flows naturally.
So what are some of the sites that intrigue you the most and why?
Well, currently, and actually ever since I did my doctoral research, I've been fascinated with the creation of structures from older structures. And I think that this is extremely significant, both as a historical phenomenon and its own sets of processes that it would have unleashed in its own time. But it's extremely significant also in the present day because this is really where material culture, where literal pieces of the past are extremely influential on political discourse. So it seems like there's a...
So that the same as a kind of reuse of materials, reuse. And so why is that important? And can you give us some examples of how that reuse works?
Well, I think it's a much more studied, much more analyzed phenomenon in the medieval period of Europe, and certainly a lot of that scholarship is extremely useful as a point of departure, as plotting out ways of thinking. But I think that there are a set of historical specificities that are peculiar to South Asia. And the most, I think, extensive, the most visible instances of reuse really have to do with this transitional period, or occurred during this transitional period with the establishment of a political Islam in northern India, what is today northern India, considerably east of the Indus River. And those are also the historical instances of reuse that have gotten, in many ways, very sadly, for unfortunate reasons, they've gotten a lot of attention because they really speak to the religiously based divides that we're confronting in so many ambits in the history of the subcontinent, really over the last millennium.
So it'll be the building blocks or materials from secular structures or temples, or going one way, going the other way, going both ways?
So what I noticed primarily was that there was the need to use the pre-existing labor structures that were in place in this particular region, and the new communities, groups of people who were settling here, foreseeably for the long term, were very interested in fashioning a physical space for themselves. So what usually survive in the historical record tend to be religious structures, precisely because they are under veneration oftentimes for centuries, therefore they're maintained. But so that said, I mean, what we really primarily have to work with would be so-called religious structures. But I think that within the Indic architectural traditions, there definitely was a sliding spectrum between what we now conventionally divide up between the religious and the secular. So iconographies that we may associate now with purely religious contexts actually would be, unsurprisingly in those times, found also in what could be considered civic structures. For instance, stepwells are a good example.
But how can this help us understand the current cultural and political climate in South Asia? I mean, where, a lot of these issues seem to be coming again in dramatic fashion that one hears or reads about.
Well, honestly, unfortunately, what I see going on, certainly in the public and the political discourse, is a historical amnesia. There is a very, very short memory, given really the historical depth of human activity in the most neutral terms in that part of the world. So honestly, I think that the very divisive interpretations of the cultural fabric that has come to be, broadly speaking, I mean, South Asian recognizably from different perspectives, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan. It actually has had very, very, I think, different resonances and has been extremely varied over time, and yet the political discourse these days has very myopically reduced it into very simplistic, very divisive terms.
One is tempted to view this as a long-term after effect of the British partition, but not alone. I mean, I think having invented Pakistan,
in many ways, partition actually occurred because of earlier colonial period activity. I mean, there's quite a bit of research just talking about really the transference, right, of the way that religion and religiosity was thought about in the colonial metropole, and the way that that was transplanted without the understandings, really the actual respect for local understandings of religiosity. After all, this was the 18th and 19th centuries definitely were a period of this civilizing burden that the West took upon itself. So any kind of complexity was actually thought of, I think, as the confused native, as opposed to a really sophisticated and very different, multifarious approach to religiosity per se. So one could say that, in fact, partition was really a result of this misunderstanding of the real richness and complexity of South Asian cultural life for centuries before that. And I think it was imposed from the top down enough so that certainly the elites who made the decisions, were indoctrinated in this way of thinking. But it's fascinating to see that once one steps out of even now the kind of urbanized elite educated circles, even now one gets very different understandings of where community identities lie, how they're to be defined, how in fact one puts words to conflicts.
Interesting. Interesting.
So I think that these multiple spheres really of cogitation exist even now.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.